I want to show you guys some of the things that I've been learning in this book. Some very interesting things. It's called The Third Reich by Michael Burleigh. And I was reading this book, and this book, I saw that it came out in the year 2000, and it shows. This was the year 2000 when a lot of people were talking about Nazism, and it was still very trendy. It was very common for people to talk about the Holocaust, and it was still a very, very hot topic. This was not too long after the film The Pianist came out. In the year 2000, you just came out of the 1990s when you had the film Schindler's List. So the Holocaust was still a very big topic. And when you read this book, it has, I can't really put my finger on it, but it has this particular style that just speaks the early 2000s. It reminds me very much of this book that I read back in the early 2000s. It was called Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg. It was a very popular book that was read by conservatives because it showed how back in the early 1900s, back in the early 20th century, the left wing or the progressive movement was in favor of eugenics, and it was in favor of Nazism or in favor of racism. And yes, there was a lot of Hitlerian ideas in progressivism back in those times. And the book was showing how the progressive movement in the past was very racist and it was very Hitlerian. And so the book was making the case that progressivism has roots in racism, eugenics, et cetera, et cetera. The only problem with the book was that it didn't really show how right-wing ideology is also rooted in the same way of thinking, and how there were Republicans back in those days who believed in eugenics, just as there were Democrats who believed in eugenics as well. So that was the problem with the book. Of course, there was a bias, but the book was very educational in the sense that it talked about the evils of progressivism and the social Darwinistic roots of progressivism. But you can see a similar style in this book. So I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, oh yeah, this book definitely came out in the year 2000. And the book touches on a similar subject that Jonah Goldberg's book touched on, and it touches on the French Revolution and how there are similarities to be found between Nazism and the ideology of the French Revolution. And this was something that tremendously fascinated me in the early 2000s. In fact, I wrote a book in the early 2000s. It was called For God or for Tyranny, in which I presented the parallels between Islam and the ideology of the French Revolution. And I'm reading this book, and I am just getting flashbacks back to those days. I'm getting just memories triggered from back from those times when I was reading about the French Revolution and I was reading about the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian genocide, and I saw the parallels between Islamic ideology and the French Revolution ideology. Now, what are the parallels, right? Like, are they extremely similar? They're not extremely similar. The Enlightenment ideology was all about being free from religion and free from institutions and free from monarchy. And in Islam, you have a history of monarchy, right? The Sultan was a monarch, so you have that monarchist tendency in Islamic history, so you can't make that parallel. But nonetheless, they are both similar in the sense that they are both anti-Christian. And that's where they have that overlap. That's the meeting point that they both come to. Islam was a revolution against Christianity. Islam was simply an Arabian branch of Arianism. That's what Islam was. It still is, right? I mean, Islam was founded truly as a continuation as a variant of the Arian heresy. And the Arian heresy was all about denying the divinity of Christ. Now, Islam goes a few steps further than Arius did, because Islam also denies the sonship of Christ. But nonetheless, Arianism definitely influenced Islamism. Muhammad was definitely influenced by the Arians. And Islam, as I said, was a revolution against Orthodox Christianity. It was a revolution against Orthodox Christianity. And I remember years ago, I wrote an article, and I did a number of videos on this topic, and it pissed off a lot of people. But years ago, I talked about how Islam is just a pre-Reformation Christian cult. It's a pre-Reformation sect. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it's very obvious what I'm trying to say. You had the Reformation, which was founded by Luther and Calvin and their ilk. And then before the Reformation, you had what the Protestants will call the Pre-Reformation thinkers, right? So you had you had your Wycliffes, and you had your Husses. You had your Pre-Reformation heretics, Pre-Reformation revolutionaries, and these were the theologians, really heretics, who would later on influence people like Martin Luther. So Luther was definitely influenced by people like Wycliffe, or people like Tyndale, people like Jan Hus, the Hussite movement. These were the pre-Reformation movements that were trying to launch revolutions against the Catholic Church. They didn't immediately succeed, but nonetheless, their influence would continue on even after their deaths, to the point that they would sow the seeds into the Reformation. They would sow the seeds that would germinate into the Reformation. And so that's why I call Islam a pre-Reformation cult, because it was before the Reformation, and it was trying to reform Christianity. It was trying to make Reformation on Orthodox Christianity, in the sense that what Islam was trying to say was exactly, what Islam was trying to do was very similar to what pre-Reformation thinkers were trying to do. Pre-Reformation thinkers and Reformation thinkers, and really every heretic that has ever existed, has pretty much said the same thing, not in terms of theological points, but in terms of a particular narrative. And that particular narrative was that the Orthodox Christian Church, the established Christian Church, corrupted the teachings of Christ. So you had the original teachings of Christ, and the Catholic Church, or the Orthodox Church, is misconstruing the teachings of Christ. And we, the pre-Reformation thinkers or the Reformation thinkers, we are trying to teach you guys what Jesus was really trying to say. And this is what Luther did. This is what Arius did. This is what Nestorius did. Like, every heretic who has ever existed has pretty much said this. You guys have corrupted the teachings of Christ. I'm going to bring you the authentic words, the authentic teachings of Christ. This is what Islam did, just like every other heretical movement before it and after it did. This is what Islam did. It basically said the church has corrupted the teachings, the Bible has been corrupted, and we are trying to give you guys the true teaching of Isa, Jesus, right? They call Jesus Isa. And this was the revolution. And the revolution was launched. And this is why in every region that Islam has taken over by the sword, Islam has done the same thing. In every Christian region that Islam has taken over, Muslims will do the same thing, right? Muslims have done the same thing. They will say, reject the Trinity. Reject the Trinity. This was the revolution. It was a revolution against the church, specifically against the Trinitarian doctrine of the church. But every heretic works against particular teachings of the church in order to undermine the church, right? This is the revolutionary strategy. And it very much so reminds me of what the Arians did. See, the Arians were very popular. The Arian heretics, who were very much like Muslims back in the 4th century, 5th century, they were, and even later on, they were spreading their message out. And like Muhammad, they were teaching that Jesus Christ is not God. This is what the Arians taught. And the Arian theology went all the way to the Germans. Yes, a lot of people don't know about this, but it's very, very fascinating. The guy who I believe made the first Germanic translation of the Bible was an Arian heretic, and his name was something Wolf. Right, in English, it would translate literally as little wolf. Wolfus, I think, something like that. Little Wolf. And Little Wolf was an Arian heretic who traveled all the way to the Germanic peoples of Central Europe, and he would spread his Arian theology to them, and a lot of Germanic peoples converted to Arianism. So a lot of Germanic peoples, they went from paganism to Arianism. And the Vandals converted to the Arian heresy. And the Vandals, who were Germanic peoples, they would invade Italy. They would invade Rome. They would also invade North Africa. And this is when the Byzantine Empire went to war against the Vandals, and the Byzantine Empire had a very famous general by the name of Belisarius. He was an ethnic Albanian who was a general for the Byzantines, and he would defeat the Vandals in North Africa. Very, very fascinating history. The Vandals, really ancient Germans, they would go all the way to North Africa. North Africa in those days wasn't Muslim. It was Christian. If you can, it's hard. I'm sure it's hard for a lot of people to believe that, but North Africa at one point in time was Orthodox Christian, and they were Trinitarian Christian. And these Germanic invaders, Germanic heretics, they would invade North Africa, and they would tell the people that they conquered to deny the Trinity or die, or be subject to some pretty horrendous torture. And they would, I think, cut people's tongues off, and they were very, very sick. People who refused to deny the Trinity, they would persecute, cut off their eyes, or I think they would cut off their tongues. They would kill them. It was just like Islam. Just like Islam. So there you had this revolution, right? And eventually the Byzantines defeated the Vandals, and they were vanquished and gotten rid of, thank God. But this was the Reformation, the Pre-Reformation revolution. And Islam was a part of that. And Islam is a very revolutionary religion. Anywhere where Muslims will have a substantial population, they will talk about revolution. This is because Islam is not a religion that is like Christianity. It's not a religion that, like Christianity, emphasizes on obedience to the state. All right, it's not like Christianity. Christianity emphasizes obedience to the state, even if the state is not Christian. Christianity emphasizes obedience. This is why St. Peter teaches, love God, obey the king. Or when you had the zealots go to Jesus and say, should we pay taxes? Because the zealots are all about not paying taxes. They were the Jewish libertarians of their day. And Jesus said, well, who's on the coin? And they said, well, Julius Caesar, or Caesar's on the coin. And Jesus said, well, pay unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Shut up. Shut the hell up, pay your taxes. Christianity emphasizes obedience to the state, even if the state is not Christian. And the reason for this is because, well, it's quite obvious. If you are going to be promoting revolution everywhere you go, then you are going to be promoting instability and chaos and craziness. And so Christianity would then be associated with those things, with chaos and revolution. And who the hell would want Christianity? Who the hell would be interested in a religion that promotes revolution? But Islam is not like that. Islam emphasizes revolution. And this is what happened in Lebanon. This is what led to the Lebanese civil war. The Palestinians led a revolution. The PLO, even though it was secular, it was definitely influenced by Islam. And The PLO was a revolutionary organization. My father knows about this stuff because he was a member of the PLO. The PLO tried to start a revolution in Jordan. They tried to overthrow the king, and that didn't work out for them. They ended up getting massacred by the Bedouins. But this is another example of this is Iran. Iran tries to spread Shiite revolutionary ideology all throughout the Middle East. This is seen in the Houthis. And the Houthis, they started a revolution against the Yemeni government, the Saudi-backed Yemeni government, and that's what led to the Saudi war against the Houthis. Islam is a revolutionary religion. Islam initially was a revolution against Christianity. So then you look at the French Revolution, and you see, what is the French Revolution? A revolution against the church. That's what it was. It was a revolution against monarchy and against Christianity. And if you look at the Enlightenment thinkers that influenced the French Revolution, they were all about revolution against Christianity. They all hated Christianity. Voltaire, Rousseau, these guys all hated Christianity. And they all talked about, well, let's revolt against tyranny, right? Rousseau and all these thinkers, they talked about revolting against tyranny. But if you read the writings of Rousseau, especially his Social Contract, you will see that Rousseau was not against tyranny. He would talk about going against, the evils of monarchy and the evils of the church, but Rousseau was an absolutist. He was an absolutist, and he wanted a civic religion. So the Enlightenment ideology that influenced the French Revolution, that would eventually lead to the French Revolution, was not really about fighting tyranny, although it claimed to be about that. But what's one thing that we all have learned about almost every political movement? Almost every political movement eventually becomes what it claimed to be against. And this is one thing that you'll figure out about political ideologues and political revolutions, is that once they get power, they tend to become what they claimed to have been fighting against. So at one point, they're fighting against tyranny and despotism, and then once they get power, they become worse than the very institutions that they were fighting against. And a prime example of that is the French Revolution. And once the revolutionaries got powerful enough, they butchered millions of people. Now, mainstream historians will say, well, they killed hundreds of thousands of people. But if you read Joseph de Maistre, and I'm not even certain if I'm pronouncing that guy's name correctly. He was French last name. French last names are impossible for me to pronounce. I have to go on Google Translate to figure out how to pronounce their last names. They have if you think English has bizarre spelling, look at French. It's annoying. It's like there's an E and there's a, what does this even mean? But Joseph de Maistre was a counter-revolutionary philosopher who lived through the French Revolution, just like other philosophers like René de Chateaubriand, who also René de Chateaubriand initially supported the revolution, and then he saw its bloody fruits and realized that it was evil, and he went against it and became a counter-revolutionary philosopher. He wrote a wonderful book called The Genius of Christianity. Some translations render it as The Beauty of Christianity. Regardless, it's a wonderful book. But Joseph de Maistre wrote a number of books against the Enlightenment ideology. And in one of the books, he says that the French Revolution led to the deaths of about 3 million people. So people were bitching about the king, but the rebels ended up butchering millions. So, people are sitting there, oh, the king is so bad. This is my philosophy when it comes to regimes. I think that if you are becoming a fat ass in your society and you're complaining about whatever regime you're living under, I think you're a moron. I think you're an asshole, and I think you're a moron. And I've seen this so many times. You see these fat bastards complaining about the government, and they're like, oh, the government is so evil, we need a revolution. Moron, you are a lard ass. You are eating KFC. What are you complaining about? What the hell are you complaining about? It's like they don't want to complain about themselves. but they need something to complain about to fill up the void in their hearts. So they have to complain about the state. And they're like, oh, yes, we need a revolution. When you get your revolution, you're going to become a kebab. You're going to become a shish kebab. They're going to put you through a pit, and then they're going to roast you over a fire. That's how a lot of these revolutionaries end up as. They end up with carnage. And a lot of people don't understand this, especially in the United States, where people have for pretty much centuries, over 200 years, been living in relative comfort. Americans have been living in relative comfort for centuries. Yes, there have been bad times, but nothing like what you read about in the histories of most countries in the world. Be they in Europe, be they in Africa, be they in Asia or the Middle East. American history is relatively calm in comparison to in comparison to the general histories of most countries. Now, the worst thing that ever happened in the United States was the Civil War. That's the worst thing that ever happened in U.S. history, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the battlefields. It was horrific. Other than that, America has been pretty good, pretty calm. Now, you have these morons in the United States who are talking about revolution all the time. And they're lard asses eating Burger King all day. My philosophy is, they're ordering food on DoorDash, and that's another thing that I'm still having difficulty fathoming. DoorDash, like, oh, I'm hungry. It's like a continual catering service. You're getting you have Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, all on your fingertips. It's just insanity. It's like the perfect recipe for mass diabetes, mass national diabetes. DoorDash. And everyone in America is living in comfort. Even people who live in the so-called projects, so-called ghetto, the hood, as they say, those people are living in pretty comfortable lives in comparison to a lot of other people in different countries. And people just don't understand how revolutionaries turn out. They just don't want to fathom it. Usually what happens when you have a revolution is the revolutionary government, or the government that is an outcome of the revolution, ends up being worse than the government that the revolutionaries were fighting against. I mean, we can kind of see that even in American history. You have the American Revolution, which was against taxation without representation. And look, Americans are taxed up the ass right now. So the whole idea, the revolution was against taxation. Well, yeah, that's true. But I think if I'm not mistaken, the American colonies or the 13 colonies that would eventually become America, I'm pretty certain were the least taxed of the British Empire, if I'm not mistaken. But look, it's taxed up. People are being taxed up the ass nowadays. So the American Revolution, upon which America was founded, was all about being against taxation. Well, we have tremendous taxation. So when you have a revolution and the revolutionaries are claiming to be against something, the revolutionary government will basically become that something that the revolutionaries claim to be fighting against. And you see that in the French Revolution. And you see the brutality in the French Revolution. Horrendous brutality. Tons of people being decapitated. Decapitations galore. People being disemboweled. Cannibalism on the streets. Yes, this happened during the French Revolution. You actually had cannibalism. Rape. People drinking blood. There was a story that I read about the French Revolution where you had these decapitators who got so exhausted from decapitating people so much that they said, let's have a drink. So some woman came over with some wine, and the decapitator said, "Oh, let's have some wine. Have some wine, man." And when the wine came, they began to take blood from the dead bodies and mix it with the wine, and they drank it. This is just demonic. These people were possessed, right? There's no other explanation. People talk about the French Revolution. They're like, oh, poverty, and there was poverty in the peasant class. These people were demonically possessed. That's possession. When you start drinking blood and eating flesh, it's demonic possession. And it was a revolution against the church, right? It was a revolution against Christianity. And there's a great quote in this book that I have been reading, and I want to read it to you guys. This is a very interesting quote. Not this page, but where is it? Here it is. So here's this line. This is from the philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, and I know about this quote. I forgot that I knew about this quote until I started reading this book. But back in the day, back in the early 2000s, when I was reading up on the French Revolution, I found this quote by Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was another one of these counter-revolutionary philosophers. He came to America. He wrote a book about the America. It's one of our sources on America when it was a brand new country, right? When it was a very, very young country, right after the revolution against the British. And Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about the French Revolution. And he said that it was basically just Islam. It was very much like Islam. And it says here in this book, Tocqueville, with whom we began, explicitly compared the French Revolution to, quote, a religious revival, calling it a, quote, species of religion which, quote, like Islam, has overrun the whole world with its apostles, militants, and martyrs. It's very interesting. And if you there's another line from this book that I want to share with you guys, and it talks about the rise of Nazism and how Nazism was a religion. It was a religion that revolted against Christianity. It revolted against Christian morals. It used a facade of Christianity in order to attract the trads, right? In order to attract the trad Protestants and the trad Catholics. Nazism, the Nazis would put up somewhat of a facade of traditionalism, somewhat of a facade of Christianity, but it also utilized folk and neo-pagan imagery. And this is why I am very wary of the trads. I'm very wary. And if you are a trad, listen up. This is why I'm so wary for you guys, because a lot of trads mean well, but one thing that I've noticed over the years is that trads are very, very vulnerable to Nazi thinking, because they become so obsessed with the idea of order and organization and cleanliness that they see Nazism and they think, wow, maybe those guys had something, right? Maybe those guys were right. And the trads, they get so caught up in talking about the Jews and reading up on the Jews and the Jewish Bolsheviks that they look to the Nazis and think maybe those were the good guys. And a lot of trads end up concluding that they were the good guys. And so they start liking the order of the Nazis, right? They start liking the organization and the suits and the aesthetics. And they will start even sympathizing. I've seen this before. They will start actually sympathizing with neo-folk / neo-pagan religion. In fact, I confronted a trad Catholic about this. This was in my debate with Martin Zellner, who was an Austrian, he's an Austrian nationalist / identitarian, which means that he's a Nazi. And he's also a trad Catholic. But he also greatly sympathizes with neo-paganism. And he sympathizes with people who wear Thor's hammer. And he himself has said that there needs to be a synthesis between Christians and neo-pagans. Well, the Nazis also did this. You see, and this is what a lot of people don't understand, or they refuse to understand, about the identitarian movement, or about this new wave of nationalism that's coming in Europe, that's been manifesting in Europe. And that is that while they are people who are quote unquote Catholic, there's a lot of neo-paganism involved. And these supposed neo-Catholics will play the harlot with the pagans because they like the imagery, they like the aesthetics, and they're just pagans themselves. I mean, they claim to be Catholic, but they're really pagan. They're just as Catholic as the Ustasha was in Croatia. You know, they had the Ustasha in Croatia during the Third Reich, and they claimed to be Catholic, but they butchered 1 million people. And so they're like the Pharisees who thought they were doing God a service when they were crucifying Christ. Well, it says here in this book, and this is very interesting, it says, there was enough familiar here to attract traditionalists, right? So there was just enough of an imagery of religion in the Third Reich, in Nazism, in the Nazi Party, to attract trads. And enough also for those seeking the frisson of the radically different. So you had a mix, and you see this sort of thing today. It's very interesting. You see people who are like trad Catholics. You know, you have your Nick Fuentes types, but then you also have these pagan types. You know, like your Sticks, Hex, and Hammers. You know, you have these pagan types who are almost like they're very liberal in their way of thinking, right? They're very liberal in their way of thinking when it comes to morals and morality. And you have these types of people today who are what you call, they're a part of what you would call the Dark Enlightenment. I think that's what they call it, right? You have your Peter Thiels and your Molyneux, and these are people who right wingers like. These are people who far right people would like. And these are people who even trad Catholics can fall for. And I've seen this myself. And I remember going to church, and I remember meeting people who were fans of Stefan Molyneux. And I would tell these people, don't you know that Stefan Molyneux is an atheist who hates Christianity, who believes in social Darwinism, eugenics? And they would say, well, I like a lot of the things that he says, so I ignore that other parts about him, right? I ignore that aspect about him. But they would fall for these types of people, these Dark Enlightenment type of people. And so the Dark Enlightenment is basically just it's a term used to label people on the internet who are they basically believe in social Darwinism, right? And they're very liberal in their morals. They're very liberal in their morality, right? They will go against Christianity, or they will go against Christian morals. They hate the Bible. But they believe in eugenics, social Darwinism, and they will use right-wing rhetoric to attract people. And they believe in this stuff. I'm not saying that they're just saying it just to attract people as propaganda, but they actually believe in this sort of thing. I think I missed my place in the book here. Here it is. But you have this Dark Enlightenment ideology, which is just the hatred of Christian teaching, the hatred of Christian morals, mixed in with nationalistic or a hardcore libertarian way of thinking. And this is becoming, this has been very attractive to a lot of people. And I think it is growing. But you had this sort of thing right before Nazism, or you had this sort of thing with Nazism, I should say. And it was those types of people who were attracted to Nazism, which is not surprising at all, because if you believe in social Darwinism, then the Nazis are your best friends. So it says, there was enough familiar here to attract traditionalists, and enough also for those seeking the frisson of the radically different. And enough, too, for those for whom violence had become a way of life, an object of nostalgia, or a pseudo-philosophy with purgative properties. So then it goes on to say, among committed believers, a mythic world of eternal spring, heroes, demons, fire and sword, in a word, the fantasy world of the nursery, displaced reality. So Fantasyland. So people who were living in a fantasy were attracted to Nazism. What kind of fantasy? The fantasy of bringing back a past mythic world of the Germanic nation. Bringing back ancient Germanic civilization before the Roman Empire existed. And this was the fantasy that a lot of these people were living in. And this is why a lot of people in those days got into Thor worship. And it's the same exact reason as to why people are getting into Thor worship and Odin worship today, because they live in Fantasyland. They want to go back to some kind of pre-Christian primordial existence. And with these types of people, all that is necessary for them to go full Nazi is some kind of a leader who can take over a country or rule over multiple countries, and to tell them that their fantasy is going to become a reality because of him. So Fantasyland. And there's a line here about the French Revolution that I thought was pretty clever. It says, guillotining, and this is the result of the fantasy, right? Because with the French Revolution, you had fantasy. With Nazism, you had fantasy. With Islam, you also have fantasy. I mean, how many times have we seen videos of people on horses, holding scimitars, raising scimitars aloft, talking about bringing back Al-Andalus, bringing back the Islamic empire, bringing back the Ottoman Empire. We've seen this sort of thing, right? Turkey has so many videos like this, showing people on horses with turbans, and they have a sultan, and they're going to bring back the sultan, and they're going to bring back the Ottoman Empire. This is Fantasyland. ISIS. What was ISIS? A bunch of fantasizers. They thought, ISIS was saying things like, yeah, we're going to bring back Al-Andalus. We're going to take over Spain. We're going to take over all of Europe. We're going to bring back the Ummah, bring back the Caliphate. Fantasyland. Trying to revive a golden era. And it's scary enough that trad Catholics are also falling into this way of thinking, right? We're going to bring back the Crusades. We're going to bring back Christendom. We're going to bring back a golden era. It's Fantasyland. And the problem with a lot of trads is that they start getting into neo-pagan aesthetics. Or, maybe they like the Vikings. Maybe they like the idea of Thor's hammer and the idea of Odin, and they like the idea of synthesizing neo-paganism and Christianity. And you see this sort of thing with the identitarian movement in Europe. So what does this fantasy eventually lead to? It eventually leads to massacres. Massacring people who you believe are the hindrance to you fulfilling your fantasy. So with the French Revolution, there was this fantasy of 100% complete equality. And I think it was Rousseau who talked about absolute democracy, and he had this idea. I'm pretty certain it was Rousseau who said this. If it wasn't, then correct me. But the Enlightenment had this idea that you could have absolute democracy. And I'm pretty certain it was Rousseau who said that the way that elections should be ran is you bring all of the citizens of a city into a certain building, or like you have all of the citizens get together and have all of them absolutely vote for whatever it is that they want. And it was this idea of absolute democracy, to the point where every single thing that a country would do would have to be voted for by the people. It couldn't be decided by elected officials as we have in the United States. It would have to be elected 100% by the people democratically. It's Fantasyland. I mean, if you could get nothing done. Imagine if every decision was determined by a democratic vote. You would get nothing done. Should we go to war? Well, we're being invaded. I don't know. Let's have a vote. I don't think so. I think we'll be fine here. It's just too many opinions. You get nothing done. This is why monarchies work much faster. But the revolutionaries of France, they had this fantasy. They were living in this fantasy land. And the Muslims live in fantasy land. Trads live in fantasy land. Neo-pagans live in fantasy land. They live in fantasy. So the end result of this fantasy is massacres, because you so desperately want to make this fantasy into a reality, but there's always a group of people who are hindrances. So with the French Revolution, who was the biggest hindrance? It was the Christians. And that's why they took Catholics, specifically people who were a part of the Vendée people in France, who still exist today. They took people of the Vendée tribe, or they took members of the Vendée people in France who were very Catholic. They would strip them naked. They would take a man and a woman, and they would tie them up together. They would put them in boats, and then they would sink the boats and drown them. So it's like a 18th century concentration camp, 18th century gas chamber. But instead of using gas, you use water. Mass drowning. Why? Because those people were the hindrance. They were the big impediment to your fantasy. ISIS comes along. Who did they murder? The Shiites, and they murdered the Christians. Why? Because, well, if we're going to make a pure Islamic state, these people are in the way. Communism is a big fantasy land as well, right? Let's have a place where everybody is equal and people control the means of production and blah, blah, blah. And you end up with starvation. The Nazis had their own fantasy. We're going to accelerate the process of evolution. The Germanic race is the superior race, and we have to make that step in the process of evolution so that we can become supermen, Übermenschen. Well, who's our hindrance? Well, it's all these people who are inferior to us, right? They're corrupting the gene pool. They are hindrances to Germans expanding into their breathing room, right? There was a term, I don't remember what was the German word for it, living space. Lebensraum, I think it was. Lebensraum, German living space. You have these inferiors, these Slavs, Jews, they're corrupting the gene pool. And so in order for us to become Übermenschen, we have to get rid of them. We have to make the human race purify the human race. It's fantasy. And even Hitler understood that it was fantasy. I think Hitler in his table talk, he said something like, this whole idea of racism is stupid and I'm just using it so I can rile up the masses. So there's a great line from this book. It describes the French Revolution, and it says, guillotining into existence their universal view of happiness until the happiness they had created consumed them. So guillotining your way into happiness. If we can just kill all these people, cut off their heads, then we can finally make a happy society. So you just keep beheading people. We haven't beheaded enough people, keep beheading people. Behead some more people. I swear, we'll get there. We'll get to our utopia. Just keep beheading them. And eventually your happiness, your utopianism, your idealism has consumed you. And that's the problem with all these racists and these communists and these lunatics. They think that they can bring into reality their fantasy, and if we can just get rid of these particular people, then we'll be happy. And you see this with the transgender cult. These people who are against the transgender cult, they're the reason why transgender people are miserable, because people are against them. So that's why they're miserable. If we can just get rid of these people, then we can finally be happy. And that's why you see a story about a transgender person going into a Christian school and shooting a bunch of kids and murdering a bunch of Christian children. Because in that sicko's mind, those Christians were the reason why that she wasn't happy. I think she was trying to be a guy, but I'm going to say she because that's her actual gender. So fantasy will destroy us. And you see this also in the book of Genesis. What does it say right there in the chapter 10 of the book of Genesis? What does it say? It says, let us build us a city and a tower whose top shall reach up to the heavens. And then you actually look at the history of this, you see, okay, it was what they were trying to build a temple tower. They were trying to build a ziggurat. The temple towers of Mesopotamia consisted of 7 stages, at least the biggest one. The temple tower of Nebuchadnezzar, we know for a fact, consisted of 7 stages. Each stage represented a planet. Why? Because they believed that the tower would bridge them with the planets who they believed were divine. So the people in Babel, in the book of Genesis, that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to connect themselves with the planets. And if you look at the word for heaven in the Hebrew, it actually signifies planets, right? The luminaries, the stars, constellations. So they believed that they were connecting to the planets, which they believed were divine. It's fantasy land. It all comes from fantasy. I think G.K. Chesterton talked about this. He said that, he described paganism as fantasy, and the idea that the sun marries the moon is all fantasy. And he says that eventually human beings get tired of the fantasy and they want to make it into a reality, and that's when you end up with things like human sacrifice. You worship the moon, you worship the planets, but you want to see some kind of action. And so because you're believing in the fantasy, because you're drunk off the fantasy, you're very open to manipulation, and that's why the Aztec high priests they were able to convince people that human sacrifice was a good thing. Eventually, Christianity came into the New World, and people were so tired of being cannibalized and sacrificed that they followed Christianity. But anyway, yeah, fantasy. Fantasy will destroy us. Fantasy will destroy us, and people will kill to make their fantasy into a reality until their fantasy consumes them. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.